Today, we're getting into some really challenging material.
We're looking at excerpts from The Myth of American Idealism, How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World by Noam Chomsky and Nathan J. Robinson.
Yeah, and this book, it really goes against the grain, doesn't it? The whole idea many of us have that, U.S. foreign policy is fundamentally about doing good in the world.
It challenges that directly. The authors argue it's much more about power, about self-interest, often masked by what they call self-aggrandizing mythology.
So our plan today is to really extract the core arguments, the key takeaways from their analysis.
Exactly. We want to focus on their main points and, crucially, the specific details they use to back them up. You'll hear about how they claim the U.S. has wielded power, the consequences, and, well, the risks they see.
Okay, let's dive in. They start with this fascinating section on what they call noble goals and mafia logic.
Right. And the argument is pretty striking. Essentially, every major power throughout history tells itself a story to justify its rule. They claim noble intentions, humane principles.
Even when the actions are, well, anything but.
Precisely. The book gives some pretty stark examples. Heinrich Himmler talking about the Holocaust as fulfilling a love of our people.
Wow.
Or Hitler claiming the occupation of Czechoslovakia was about peace and social welfare. Even Robespierre framing the reign of terror as an emanation of virtue. It's quite the pattern.
It really is. And they bring in Edward Said's observation too, don't they?
They do. Said pointed out how every single empire has said that it is not like all the others, that it has a mission, uses force only as a last resort. The whole we're different narrative.
The idea of American exceptionalism fits right in there then.
It certainly seems to be the kind of thing they're critiquing. Andrew Kopkind is also mentioned, talking about the universal desire of statesmen to make their most monstrous missions seem like acts of mercy.
So there's this need almost for leaders to convince themselves that the violence is justified.
That's the argument, that it's hard to just admit to immorality. And they introduce this term mafia logic, the sort of ruthless, self-interested calculation where control and profit are paramount, disguised by these grand narratives.
So behind the noble justifications, what do the authors say is really driving U.S. policy, according to their research?
Well, they point to this pretty astonishing 1948 document. George Kennan, head of the State Department planning staff at the time.
Kennan, right. What did he say?
It's incredibly blunt. He wrote, and I'm quoting here, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. Our real task is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity."
Maintain the disparity, not reduce it.
Exactly. And he continues, "We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights. The less we are then hampered by idealistic slogans, the better."
Wow. That just lays it bare, doesn't it? No talk of democracy or freedom there.
None at all. It's pure pragmatism, focused on maintaining economic dominance. And the authors argue this mindset shaped how U.S. planners viewed the world.
Oh, so?
Regions were assigned functions. Southeast Asia, for example, was seen as a source of raw materials and a market. The Middle East, a stupendous source of strategic power, the richest economic prize.
So countries and people reduced to resources and markets.
That's the implication. And anything that threatened Western access to these resources, specifically nationalism, a country wanting to control its own destiny, was seen as a serious threat.
Which led to these core missions of global management.
Right. Containing rivals, controlling energy, crucially, barring independent nationalism, and importantly, managing the U.S. population to go along with it all.
So for you listening, this framework is key. It suggests that what often looks like altruism might have this deeply pragmatic, power-driven core. It helps explain a lot of the actions we're about to discuss.
Absolutely. And that leads into the next major point, how the human costs of pursuing this dominance are often hidden or, sanitized.
Yeah, they reference Adam Smith, who noted way back that war can become almost an amusement for people far away, just seeing numbers and abstractions.
A chilling thought. And the authors talk about how modern defense intellectuals use abstraction and euphemism. They can discuss nuclear war, basically blow up the world while standing and chatting over the coffee pot without grappling with the horror.
It creates distance.
Exactly. Keeps the reality at arm's length.
And they mentioned journalist Ashley Banfield, who spoke out about the Iraq war coverage.
Yes, she pointed out how Americans saw curated images, not the reality of where those bullets landed, not what a mortar strike actually does. The horrors were completely left out, she said.
We rarely see the aftermath of a drone strike on a wedding or a god, a child crushed by a tank. Those images are kept from us.
Which raises a critical question the authors pose. Why focus so much on the U.S.?
Right. They're clear the U.S. isn't uniquely evil, are they?
No, they state that explicitly. No worse than many other ruling powers. But, and this is the key, it is especially powerful.
And with great power.
Comes great consequence. They argue it's more consequential if a powerful country departs from a moral standard. And ethically, they say, it is of little moral value to condemn the wrongdoing of someone else and ignore one's own.
So the focus is on our own government because that's where we as citizens have responsibility and the potential to affect change.
Precisely. It forces a question on you. If you condemn terrorism or aggression elsewhere, are you willing to apply that same standard to your own government's actions?
Understanding these hidden costs, then, is about seeing past the spin and recognizing your own role in demanding accountability.
Definitely. And to illustrate these points, the authors delve into specific case studies. Vietnam is a major one.
Characterized as a war of annihilation. Where did U.S. involvement start, according to them?
It started with supporting French colonialism in Indochina. And the motive wasn't idealism, but again, strategic resources and the U.S. global strategic position. They note policymakers knew Ho Chi Minh was seen locally as the symbol of nationalism.
But they backed the French anyway, and then later the Diem regime in the South.
Yes, a regime they describe as corrupt and incompetent, ruling through substantial violence, even using guillotines via roving tribunals to execute opponents.
And the U.S. blocked peace efforts.
Repeatedly, according to the book, including proposals from the National Liberation Front for neutralization. Instead, the U.S. escalated, leading to that war of annihilation.
The scale of bombing they describe is just mind-boggling.
It really is. 7 million tons of bombs, including hundreds of thousands of tons of napalm. That's more than 3 times the bomb tonnage dropped in all of World War II, just in Southeast Asia.
And chemical weapons, too, like Agent Orange.
Yes, leading to massive crop destruction, long-term environmental damage, and of course, horrific health consequences. They also detail a specific policy of generating refugees.
Generating refugees, you mean intentionally driving people from their homes?
That's exactly what they mean. Bombing and shelling villages specifically to deprive the enemy of the population. General Westmoreland apparently acknowledged this cold-blooded strategy quite openly.
How is this justified or even psychologically possible?
Dehumanization played a huge role, the authors argue, calling the Vietnamese gooks, dinks, animals, promoting the racist idea that the Oriental doesn't put the same high price on life as does the Westerner.
That makes it easier to ignore the suffering.
Tragically, yes. They quote Nixon saying, "You're so goddamn concerned about the civilians and I don't give a damn. I don't care." And Kissinger's reply wasn't about morality, but about PR. "I don't want the world to be mobilized against you as a butcher."
Transactional.
Utterly. And this pattern, they argue, repeats. Look at Iraq, the 2003 invasion.
Which they call the deadliest act of aggressive warfare in this century.
The number they cite are devastating. At least 500,000 Iraqis dead, maybe more, with 300,000 being violent deaths. Collapse of healthcare, soaring child mortality, millions displaced, a generation of orphans, infrastructure ruined.
And the irony, or perhaps the hypocrisy they point out, is that the U.S. had previously supported Saddam Hussein.
Right. His worst crimes, like the Anfal genocide against the Kurds, happened with U.S. protection and support. Even the Bush Sr. administration saw him as a force for moderation for a time.
While simultaneously using propaganda, like that false story about babies and incubators, to justify the first Gulf War in '91.
Exactly. And that war had its own atrocities, like the bombing of the Amiria shelter in Baghdad, killing hundreds of civilians, mostly women and children, or the Highway of Death incident.
Then fast forward to 2004, the assault on Fallujah.
Described as particularly heinous. Reports of doctors trapped in the hospital, people bleeding out in the streets, and that chilling message found scrawled on a wall, "Fuck Iraq and every Iraqi in it."
So what are the official reasons for the 2003 war, WMDs?
The authors argue the real motives were different, citing figures like Alan Greenspan, the former Fed chair. He apparently said, "I am saddened that it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows. The Iraq War is largely about oil."
And Senator Chuck Hagel echoed that.
Yes. People say we're not fighting for oil. Of course we are. Pretty direct statements from insiders.
Yet, the architects of that war, Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney,
have lived prosperous and comfortable lives, as the authors put it. Bush paints, gets profiled. Well, the immense death toll goes largely unaddressed in terms of accountability under international law.
It's a disturbing contrast,
It is. And the final case study they examine is Israel and Palestine.
where they make the bold claim that Israeli actions are effectively U.S.-Israeli actions.
Yes, because of the massive ongoing economic, diplomatic, military, and ideological support from the U.S. They argue this makes the U.S. directly complicit, directly responsible.
They give a specific example from Gaza.
A very poignant one from 2022. A mother, Najwa Abu Hamada, whose 19-year-old son, Khalil, was killed along with 14 other children in Israeli airstrikes, strikes they call preemptive, using American-made planes.
And they provide historical context, too, about the origins of the conflict.
Right. They quote early Zionist leaders like Jabotinsky, who apparently saw Zionism plainly as a colonizing venture that would require force against the native population because voluntary agreement is out of the question.
A view that conflict was inevitable from the start.
And that's the implication. And they describe the post-1967 situation as a harsh military occupation involving land confiscation, illegal settlement, and daily humiliation, fear, and oppression for Palestinians.
They also mentioned the 2006 Gaza elections.
Yes, framing the Hamas victory as a terrible crime in the eyes of the U.S. and Israel, leading to a U.S.-backed coup attempt, increased Israeli violence, withholding funds, even cutting off water.
And the scale of U.S. aid is central to their argument.
Absolutely staggering. $236 billion in 2018 since WWII, the largest cumulative recipient. And they point out this likely violates U.S. law, which technically prohibits aid to systematic human rights violators.
It continues.
Yeah.
And the U.S. role in blocking peace settlements.
They argue the U.S. has consistently stood in the way of peace, particularly by vetoing UN resolutions supporting a two-state solution based on international borders ever since the mid-70s, blocking the international consensus.
The book also details violence against protesters, doesn't it?
Horrifically so. The 2018 Gaza Great March of Return, peaceful protesters, including a double amputee in a wheelchair, and men on crutches being shot by Israeli snipers.
And then the escalation in 2023.
Described with terms like gruesome scenes, citing death tolls over 30,000 Palestinians. They quote Israeli intelligence sources admitting civilians were knowingly killed in large numbers to target single commanders with virtually no restraints.
And the rhetoric they quote from Israeli officials.
It's chilling. Major General Ghassan Alian saying human animals must be treated as such. You wanted hell, you will get hell. Dehumanizing language again.
And the U.S. concern was about journalists.
About journalists potentially showing the devastation during a ceasefire, according to the authors. Highlighting, again, the effort to control the narrative and obscure the reality.
So, looking across Vietnam, Iraq, Palestine, it paints a picture of consistent priorities, doesn't it? Power, resources, strategic position, taking precedence over human rights or international law.
That's the central thread the authors trace through these examples, often with immense, often hidden human cost.
Which brings up a really important question they tackle. How does this system persist? Why isn't policy more aligned with what the public might actually want? This democracy deficit.
Right. They explore why there's often so little correlation between the public's preferences and actual policy. They quote John Mearsheimer saying, public opinion matters hardly at all. Decisions are made by a small number of elites.
Mearsheimer even suggested Democratic leaders lie more because they can be voted out.
An interesting, provocative point he makes, yes, because they need to manage public perception more carefully than autocrats might.
So if not the public, who does influence foreign policy, according to Chomsky and Robinson?
Primarily, they argue, internationally oriented business leaders, people from major corporations, banks, powerful law firms. They echo Adam Smith's warning about merchants and manufacturers having an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public.
It creates a cycle. Wealth concentration leads to power concentration, which leads to policies that further concentrate wealth.
That's the dynamic they describe. John Dewey's quote really captures it. Politics is the shadow cast on society by big business. They argue these elites see the public mind as a potential threat to be managed.
And this isn't a new phenomenon. They trace it back.
All the way back to the U.S. founding. John Jay. Those who own the country ought to govern it. Madison wanting to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Hamilton distrusting the mass of people.
A fundamental skepticism of democracy from the start, then.
Held by some influential founders, yes. And later figures like Walter Lippmann, with his idea of the bewildered herd, the public as spectators, not participants, needing to be guided.
And they discuss that crisis of democracy report from the 70s.
Yes, Samuel Huntington arguing there was an excess of democracy back then, with marginalized groups making too many demands, needing more apathy and non-involvement from the public.
Wow, it's quite an admission.
It is. And the authors connect this to the use of fear as a control mechanism, like Senator Vandenberg's advice in 47 to scare the hell out of the American people about the Soviets.
The Cold War itself used as a tool for domestic control.
They suggest it was a kind of arrangement where both superpowers used the threat of the other to justify internal repression and external actions.
So understanding this democracy deficit is key for you, the listener. It suggests your own concerns might not be the primary drivers of foreign policy. The public is often managed, not consulted.
It's a crucial piece of the puzzle they present for understanding how U.S. power operates.
Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive into the myth of American idealism presents a really stark picture.
It does. A consistent pattern, they argue, where U.S. foreign policy, behind the rhetoric, follows a logic of power and economic interest, often leading to tremendous human suffering that's kept out of sight.
And the authors stress this isn't about being anti-American, right? It's about holding one's own government accountable, especially given the U.S.'s global power.
Exactly. Because that's where citizens have the most leverage and responsibility. And we've seen how the democracy deficit allows this system to operate with limited public input.
The book concludes by looking at, really, the ultimate stakes.
Two existential threats: nuclear war and environmental catastrophe. And they argue that the patterns of U.S. policy we've discussed contribute significantly to both dangers.
But it's not all doom and gloom in their conclusion, is it? There's a call to action.
There is, and it's powerful. They say the means to address these crises are largely understood. Things like nuclear weapons-free zones, which the U.S. often blocks, or a Green New Deal phasing out fossil fuels. The solutions, or the outlines of them, exist.
The question is political will.
Precisely. Is the will there? They point to history, mass movements like anti-slavery, civil rights, and courageous individuals. They mentioned Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, Rachel Corrie, who took great risks.
So the final thought they leave us with and leave you with is really a challenge.
It is. Will you choose to understand how power works, to ask these fundamental moral questions, and to take responsibility for what happens next, for the future?